Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you're someone who believes in empathy, justice, and truth, you're in the right place. They say time heals everything, but what if the wound keeps getting reopened again and again in everyday moments that most people don't even notice? Racism isn't always loud. It doesn't always scream through burning crosses or hateful slurs. Sometimes it whispers through silence avoidance and lost opportunities. Some might say, come on, things are better now. Why keep talking about racism? Others might argue, exactly because it's hidden now. It's more dangerous than ever. Where do you stand? Before we get into the full story, don't forget to share, and subscribe
Peace
to our
without
channel.
accountability
Your
isn't
support
peace at all.
helps us bring more real
It's
voices,
permission.
raw truths, and honest
Peace without
conversations to light.
accountability isn't peace
Every
at
click
all.
counts, and every
It's
story
permission.
matters. Now let's begin. The night was too still for a place like Charleston. The street lamps along Meeting Street hummed faintly, casting pale circles of light over cracked sidewalks and shuttered shops. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train's horn wailed a haunting sound that seemed to drag the darkness along with it. At 2 a.m., most of the city slept. But near the edge of an old neighborhood, a shadow moved, where no one should have been, a small figure stepping lightly out of a parked patrol car, glancing over his shoulder like a thief, even though the badge on his chest was supposed to stand for protection. He crouched by a black SUV, parked in the driveway of a modest brick home, its windows dark, the yard meticulously kept. The man's hands didn't hesitate. A small blade flashed briefly in the streetlight before it sank into the rubber of the rear tire with a quiet hiss. The air slipped out like a dying breath, the sound barely audible but deliberate. The officer, Chad Renner, as the stitched name tag would later reveal, grinned as he worked stabbing the tire twice more before straightening up, brushing off his gloves like it was nothing. He turned to another shadow leaning against the patrol car, a second cop, who chuckled at whatever crude joke Renner made before they both climbed in and drove off into the night as if they'd just finished a harmless prank. Inside the house, Althea Monroe didn't hear a thing. She was used to the creaks of her 1940s home, the distant thrum of passing trains, the occasional hoot of a night owl perched in the oaks. The 67-year-old former Delta Force operator, known years ago only by her call sign, Spectre 6, slept as she always did, one ear tuned to the world. But this time, the violation was too quiet to catch. She'd been trained to detect snipers on rooftops and bombs buried beneath dirt roads in far-off deserts. But she never expected to need those instincts here, in the quiet streets of her retirement. By morning, the tire sagged lifeless against the driveway. Althea stood there with her coffee in hand, staring down at it. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were calculating. It was the third flat in 16 days. The first, she told herself, might have been a nail from the roadwork 2 blocks over. The second, maybe a bad patch job from the local garage. But this one felt like a message. The slit in the rubber was too clean, too deliberate, and too similar to the others to be random. She crouched down, running her fingers along the cut, feeling the precision in the way the rubber had been opened, as if by someone who had all the time in the world and no fear of being caught. She didn't curse, didn't mutter. She just stood, letting the cool morning air settle over her like armor. She'd lived too many lives to waste emotion on the obvious. Instead, she scanned the street, a retired couple across the road watering their flowers, a jogger with earbuds in, oblivious, A few houses flying their American flags like shields, and a black sedan creeping past a little slower than it needed to before vanishing around the corner. As she turned to head back inside, a voice called out softly, "Miss Monroe, got a second?" It was Tyrell Martin, her 28-year-old neighbor, a wiry man with a hesitant way about him, scratching his beard, like he was working up the nerve to say something he wasn't sure he should. He held up his phone. I think you need to see this." Althea wiped her fingers on her jeans and walked over. Tyrell tapped his screen, pulling up a grainy night vision video from his new doorbell camera. The footage showed the street outside her house time-stamped 2:07 a.m. A patrol car rolled to a stop, lights off. A white officer with a stocky build and buzz cut stepped out, glancing around before crouching by her SUV. The glint of metal, the subtle downward motion of his arm, and the faint hiss of air told the story. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look afraid. When he finished, he laughed with his partner, leaning on the hood, then slipped back into the car, driving off as if nothing had happened. Tyrell swallowed. That from last Tuesday, Althea's eyes didn't leave the screen. Same time the tire went flat. "Yeah," Tyrell said, lowering his voice like the night itself might be listening. "That's Officer Chad Renner. He patrols around here most nights. Folks been saying he's got a reputation." Althea handed the phone back, her face still unreadable. "Send me the video," she said, already turning toward her garage. Tyrell hesitated. "You want me to file a report, call somebody?" She paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "Already saved it. I'll handle it." Inside her garage, she sat on the old wooden bench that had been her workshop for decades. It was scarred with the marks of a different life, cleaning rifles, fixing gear, patching things far more vital than a tire. She reached under the bench and pulled out a weathered ammo box, flipping it open with a practiced hand. Inside, nestled among keepsakes from a world most civilians would never know, were a faded task force coin, a patch from Operation Gothic Serpent, and a black and white photograph of 6 figures in desert camo, their faces blurred except for hers. She traced the edge of the patch with her thumb before setting it back. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. Spectre 6 had spent decades mastering a different kind of response, quiet, deliberate, and final. And though Officer Renner didn't know it yet, the line he'd crossed wasn't one that ended with a patched tire and a shrug. Althea Monroe wasn't looking for revenge. Revenge was messy, impulsive. She wanted something far cleaner, a reckoning the kind that left no room for denial, no space for the same rot to grow back again. As the morning sun crept higher, she poured the rest of her coffee into the sink and reached for a yellow legal pad, the kind she used to use for mission briefings. At the top of the page, she wrote 2 words in sharp, deliberate strokes: pattern, proof. Then she underlined them twice. In Charleston, whispers had a way of turning into storms, and the storm Officer Renner had just stirred awake was one he couldn't begin to see coming. By the time dusk painted the skies over Charleston in bands of pink and bruised purple, Althea Monroe had already started the routine she trusted most: observation without interference. She didn't act rashly. She'd learned in places far from home, Fallujah, Kandahar, Mogadishu, that the first move wasn't to strike but to see. See everything, connect the threads, and let the pattern reveal itself like a shadow pulling into focus. She spent the next few nights quietly walking the streets, not like a soldier on patrol, but like a neighbor lingering after sundown. A soft smile to those who passed, casual conversations about weather and sports, Nothing that would draw suspicion. But every step, every glance, she was mapping the neighborhood in her mind. Renner's squad car came by 3 nights out of 5, always between 1:30 and 3:00 a.m. Always slow enough to look, but never so slow as to invite questions. Twice she saw him idle at the corner, by a shuttered laundromat lights off, as if waiting for something or someone to justify a stop. Her notes grew line by line on the yellow pad, each tire incident marked with a timestamp, Tyrrell's footage cataloged by frame Renner's patrol route annotated like an old battlefield diagram. This wasn't paranoia. It was the foundation of proof. She didn't need to convince herself what was happening. She needed to make it undeniable to anyone who thought a slashed tire was just bad luck, and whispers about a cop were just noise. By the 4th night, the whispers started to reach her ears more directly. Miss Alma, the 74-year-old widow, who lived 2 houses down, leaned over her garden fence to tell Althea about her grandson. 3 stops in 1 month, Alma muttered, glancing around like the magnolia trees might be wired for sound. Same excuse, every time, suspicious behavior. You know what suspicious means when you're 17? And black it means existing. Althea nodded, saying nothing, letting Alma's words settle into the growing ledger in her head. At the auto shop on King Street, Jared, a soft-spoken man with hands stained from years of engine grease, mentioned a customer whose windows had been smashed after a heated exchange with an officer. No proof, no witnesses, but Jared remembered the number painted on the squad car. It matched the one Tyrrell's footage had captured. Every piece fit into the outline of something Renner wanted to keep blurred harassment small enough to deny frequent, enough to wear people down, deliberate enough to feel like a net tightening around anyone who dared exist outside the lines he'd drawn. But Althea wasn't the kind to rely on anecdotes alone. She drove up to Columbia the next afternoon to meet Gene Powell, an old friend from a different life, a former Air Force tech sergeant, now buried in civilian paperwork at the county records office. Gene owed Althea more than one favor debts that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Over mugs of stale coffee in a diner that hadn't changed since 1982, John slid a manila envelope across the table. Pulled what I could without setting off alarms, she said. 5 complaints. 7 years. Everyone filed by a black resident. Everyone closed for insufficient evidence. No body cam footage on record. No follow-ups. Althea thumbed through the copies, each one telling the same story in different handwriting searches without cause. Verbal abuse tickets, issued and dropped with no explanation. One report, from 3 years back, claimed Renner muttered a slur under his breath during a late-night stop. Another described a woman forced to sit on a curb in freezing rain while her crying children watched from their car seats. Buried, Althea asked. Filed, Jean corrected softly. Filed where no one would find them, unless they knew where to dig. Now you do. Althea closed the folder and looked up. Keep your name off this. Jean gave a small smile. Already did. But Althea, you're poking at something they don't want unearthed. Be careful whose doors you knock on. Caution had never been her weakness, but hesitation had never been her trait either. That night, Althea pinned a map to the wall in her den, marking it with red dots for each complaint, each story, each incident Tyrrell whispered her way. The map lit up like a constellation of quiet suffering, a pattern Renner probably thought would stay fragmented, each dot isolated enough that no one would see the shape it made when connected. But Althea saw it. She saw the rhythm in Renner's patrol, the timing of his stops, the neighborhoods he lingered in. She traced the lines with a finger, following them, not like a resident, But like the operative, she used to be the one who'd been trained to hunt movements and motives in shadows. She wasn't alone anymore either. Dana Martin Tyrrell's cousin came by one evening with a battered laptop and a sharp tongue. Dana worked for a local nonprofit that tracked police interactions, and Renner's name was one she'd flagged 4 times in 6 months. We requested body cam footage for 2 incidents, Dana said, scrolling through files and timestamps. Both times, equipment malfunction. Different dates, different neighborhoods, same excuse. Althea arched an eyebrow. Both. You know how rare that is. It's not a glitch. It's a pattern. Althea studied Dana, appreciating her bluntness. I'll need your records. Dana hesitated. You planning to file a complaint? No, Althea said flatly. I'm planning to prove one. The words weren't defiant. They were calm, measured the same tone she'd used years ago when briefing her team before a mission. There was no satisfaction in it, no thrill, just purpose. As the clock neared midnight that evening, Althea sat alone in her den. The lights low, the faint flicker of muted television painting the walls in shifting shadows. She looked at the photo pinned above her map, the one from her Delta days, the 5 other blurred figures, the desert stretching behind them, the fading Sharpie inscription on the back, "Hold the line, no matter the storm." She whispered it once more to herself than to anyone. No matter the storm. She knew what came next wasn't about a tire or even about Chad Renner. It was about everyone who'd watched him grin and get away with it, because no one had the proof, because no one wanted to dig deep enough to find it. Now she had the map, the footage, the testimonies, and the records. But for the reckoning to matter, she needed one more thing to show the city, not just the pattern, but the truth behind it, a truth no one could dismiss as a coincidence or misfortune. The darkness was thick outside her window, but Althea Monroe didn't flinch. The deeper the dark, the clearer the patterns became. And soon the city would see them too. The city was louder now, even when the streets were still. It wasn't the sound of car horns or late-night laughter, but a tension beneath the rhythm of Charleston that Althea Monroe could feel every time her boots met the pavement. Something was shifting, not enough for most people to name it, yet but enough for her instincts, sharpened by decades of training to sense the tremor before the quake. The folder on her kitchen table had thickened into something formidable. It was no longer a collection of scattered notes and neighborhood whispers. It was a map of corruption stitched together with timestamps, testimonies, official complaints, and the damning footage from Terrell's ring cam. Still, Althea knew paper alone wouldn't bend the system. The people who signed off on men like Chad Renner had spent years turning paper into ash when no one was watching. That meant she needed something more powerful than a file. She needed momentum, people voices, and pressure that couldn't be ignored or buried under insufficient evidence again. It started quietly in a fellowship hall behind a small church on Meeting Street. Althea met Dana Martin there, after hours the folding tables littered with laptop chargers and stacks of community surveys. Dana's nonprofit had been tracking police interactions for years, and her anger wasn't quiet like Althea's. I've been filing complaints and press releases for months, Dana said, scrolling through her database, but they vanish. Local reporters shrug, city council says, we'll look into it. And then nothing. It's like screaming into a hurricane. Althea didn't interrupt, just studied the screen. Patterns, names, dates, the same circles of harassment looping over and over Renner's name, a repeated echo. She tapped the screen gently. How many of these can we verify? without risking the people who filed them. Dana exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Half maybe. Most folks don't want to go on record. They've seen what happens when you poke the badge. Althea met her eyes, steady and calm. Then we don't make them poke it. We hold it up to the light ourselves. It wasn't bravado. It was planning. Althea's mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, charting out what needed to happen and in what order. First, consolidate every shred of documented proof: the complaints, the doorbell footage, the malfunctioning body cam, logs the interviews. Second, bring in someone who knew how to make a city listen, without reducing it all to a sensational headline that would burn fast and die quicker. That second step led her north just outside the city to a closed barber shop with a faded mural on its wall. Alvin Reese was waiting inside, the semi-retired journalist with a reputation for precision over flash. He leaned against a cracked leather chair, chewing on a toothpick, as Althea walked in her folder under one arm. "Monroe," he said, a low rasp in his voice. "Didn't expect to see the ghost walk through my door again." She placed the folder on the chair between them. Not a ghost anymore. Just someone who won't let rot grow unchecked. Reese flipped through the document slowly, his brow tightening as he pieced it together. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his tone was deliberate. "This isn't just about Renner. This is about the cracks that let him thrive." "Exactly," Althea said. "If it's just him, they'll cut him loose, call it a bad apple, and keep everything else hidden. I want the tree shaken, not just a branch trimmed." Reese nodded slowly, sliding the folder back. "I can build the story. Careful. Clean. But once this drops, it's going to pull you into the light, whether you like it or not." "I don't care about the light," Althea replied. "I care about the weight. Make it heavy enough they can't ignore it." Over the next 3 nights, Althea barely slept. She met with neighbors who had stayed silent for years, not to coax statements, but to listen and document. One man, voice shaking, recounted how Renner followed his teenage daughter home twice, circling her block until she bolted into the house. A mother told her how she was made to stand in the cold for 20 minutes, while Renner ran plates that came back clean, her 2 toddlers crying in the back seat the whole time. Althea didn't push them to go public. She didn't need faces for the story to matter, just enough detail, corroborated and cross-referenced to paint a picture that even the city's most polished deniers couldn't whitewash. She worked methodically each step, as deliberate as the way she used to clear rooms in hostile territory, calm, slow, no wasted motion. But Renner wasn't oblivious. He'd begun to notice her now. Twice his cruiser slowed as she walked the sidewalk near her home. The second time, he stopped entirely, rolling down his window with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You patched that tire yet, Miss Monroe?" He asked, the mockery light but deliberate. Althea met his gaze evenly, saying nothing, just letting the silence stretch. It unsettled him. His smirk wavered before he drove off, the cruiser's taillights bleeding red into the night. Inside, Althea made another note in her ledger. He's starting to sense the shift. That same night, Reese called. "I can get the piece ready within a week," he said. "But if we want it to stick, we need a human angle. Numbers and files don't move people. Stories do. Are you willing to be that story?" Althea's silence held for a moment, the weight of the question settling between them. She had spent her entire life avoiding the spotlight, building a reputation in places where shadows were safer than names. But this wasn't about comfort. This was about a line being crossed, first on her driveway, then across her entire community. She finally answered, her voice steady. "If it keeps this from happening to someone else, then yes. But you tell it my way." No hero worship, no war stories, just the truth. Reese exhaled softly. Then we're in business. The fault lines beneath Charleston were shifting, no longer invisible. Each story, each timestamp, each red dot on Althea's map was another tremor. And Althea Monroe, who had spent her life enduring storms, was about to make sure this one hit with enough force to bring the cracks into full daylight. By the time the first article dropped, Charleston was already humming with tension. Not the kind that fades by morning, but the kind that lingers in the air like a static charge waiting for the spark. The stillness that Althea Monroe had felt building beneath the surface was finally cracking, and the cracks were spilling into the streets. It began with whispers shared quietly in church basements and over late-night phone calls, and then grew into something far louder. By the second evening, after Alvin Reese's article went live, crowds gathered outside City Hall, candles flickering in cupped hands. They weren't chanting yet, not loud, not angry, but the silence was its own kind of roar, a collective pause before the inevitable surge. Althea didn't plan to stand in the middle of it. She had never been one for podiums or crowds, but the streets had a way of pulling you in when the ground beneath your feet started to shake. Tyrell Martin called her the morning after the first vigil. "They're asking for you," he said, voice low but insistent. "Not to lead, just to stand with them. People know what you did, Althea. They need to see you there." She hesitated. Leadership was never her ambition. Survival and integrity had always been enough. But something told her this wasn't about her comfort. It was about everyone else's courage. That night, she walked to the steps of City Hall. She didn't climb them. She stayed with the crowd, hands deep in her coat pockets, a quiet figure among dozens of neighbors, holding photos of their families, copies of complaints, or nothing at all but their presence. Dana was there too, moving through the group, documenting faces and names, while Reese stood back with his camera slung low, capturing not spectacle, but stillness. The tremor became a rumble on the third day. A clip from Reese's story. Althea speaking calmly about respect, and the weight of silence hit national feeds, carried by veteran networks and community advocates alike. Suddenly, Charleston wasn't just another southern city. It was a flashpoint. More families came forward, some with their own doorbell footage, others with phone recordings of quiet encounters that had left them shaken. The narrative shifted from one rogue officer to a culture of dismissal and evasion that had spread through the department like mold. That evening, the vigil grew into something larger. The candles were replaced by signs. Chants replaced whispers. Reporters filled the sidewalks, microphones outstretched lights glaring in the early dusk. Althea stood back, at first, a steady presence rather than a focal point. But when a teenager near the front faltered mid-sentence, the crowd urging him on, she stepped forward, not to take the spotlight, but to steady it. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. This isn't just about one man with a badge. It's about a system that let his shadow stretch this far without question. We're not here to burn it all down. We're here to demand it does better, because we deserve better. The streets answered not with chaos, but with unity. The chant that followed wasn't rage, but resolve. No more silence. No more shadows. By midnight, the footage of Althea speaking under the pale glow of streetlights was everywhere. It wasn't fiery. It wasn't theatrical. It was grounded, the kind of steady force that made people stop scrolling and start listening. Renner, for the first time, went dark. No patrols. No smug encounters on the sidewalk. His cruiser disappeared from its usual routes. but the department couldn't hide with him. Under growing pressure, the police chief announced a comprehensive internal review, a phrase meant to calm the city, but only fanned the flames. As the chants continued outside City Hall, Althea walked home through streets that felt different now, not lighter, not yet, but alive. People weren't whispering anymore. The silence had cracked wide open, and there was no patching it back together. For the first time, the tremble of the streets felt less like fear and more like the first steps of something that could finally change. The council chambers smelled of old wood and tension, the kind that clung to every polished surface and hung heavy in the air. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, a faint constant drone beneath the growing murmur of voices filling the hall. Althea Monroe sat in the front row, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had not dressed to make a statement, but her presence did it for her unflinching calm, the embodiment of someone who had already weathered storms far greater than the one unfolding in this room. At the dais, Mayor Blaine Riddick cleared his throat, his usual confidence muted by the restless energy of the crowd. "We are here tonight." He began his voice, carefully measured, to address the growing concerns raised by our community regarding Officer Chad Renner and the broader issues within the Charleston Police Department. His words, though smooth, felt more like a shield than a promise. The people in the room, residents, clutching documents, photographs, even handwritten notes, were no longer willing to settle for polished sentences. Dana stood near the aisle, her camera recording, while Terrell leaned against the far wall, his phone poised to stream live to anyone outside who couldn't fit in the hall. Reese was perched at the back, notebook open, capturing each shift in tone, every flicker of discomfort on the faces of the council members. The weight of the past weeks, the footage, the testimonies, the voices that had finally risen above a whisper pressed into every corner of the room. When the public comment session opened, one by one, voices spilled into the microphone. Tanisha Bell, a mother whose teenage son had been stopped twice by Renner, spoke first. Her voice trembled at the start, but steadied as she described her boy's fear, the way he now avoided walking alone after school. Others followed, a retired bus driver, recounting years of subtle intimidation, a high school teacher reading from a student's journal entry about being tailed by a cruiser for 3 blocks. Each story layered atop the last, forming a chorus of quiet outrage and undeniable evidence. And then the room stilled. The mayor glanced toward Althea. "Ms. Monroe," he said, "if you wish to speak, the floor is yours." She rose slowly, each step deliberate as she approached the podium. The microphone crackled as she adjusted it, but she didn't flinch. She let the silence linger just long enough to command attention. "I didn't come here to fight a man." She began, her voice low but steady. "I came here because I watched the system turn its back on the people it claims to serve. Because I've seen neighbors patch their wounds quietly, believing that silence is the cost of keeping the peace." Her gaze swept the council, then the audience. It isn't. Peace without accountability isn't peace at all. It's permission. And for too long, this department and those overseeing it have given permission, whether by looking away, bearing complaints, or excusing behavior as isolated incidents. She held up a folder, thick with documents, the files, the testimonies, the evidence Reese had so meticulously compiled. "This isn't a rumor. These are names, dates, and patterns. They tell the truth that's been ignored." The room was so quiet the hum of the lights seemed louder. "I don't need recognition. I don't want applause. I want to know if this council is willing to face the truth it's been avoiding. Because if not, the people in this room will make sure the truth is heard elsewhere and louder. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words sharpened by calm resolve, struck deeper than anger could. Mayor Riddick cleared his throat, his polished demeanor cracking just slightly. We appreciate your candor, Ms. Monroe. The council will be reviewing. A voice from the audience cut in strong and certain. It was Terrell stepping forward, not reviewing, acting. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, a unified current demanding more than promises. Under the mounting pressure, the council shifted. By the end of the session, they voted unanimously to authorize an independent state investigation, not only into Renner's actions, but into the Charleston Police Department's entire complaint handling process over the past decade. The gavel struck 3 times, each echo sharp and final, the sound of a door finally creaking open where so many had been slammed shut. As the chamber emptied, Althea didn't linger for cameras or congratulations. She stepped into the cool evening air, the chatter of the dispersing crowd fading behind her. Dana caught up to her near the steps. You realize what you just did in there, right? Althea glanced at her, but kept walking. I didn't do it, she said simply. We did. All of us. And it's only the first step. The street lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. For the first time in weeks, Althea felt the weight in her chest lighten, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally truly begun. The echoes of the gavel still rang in her ears, not as an ending, but as a signal. Change was coming, and this time there would be no silence to bury it. Althea Monroe's story began, as so many do, with something seemingly small. A flat tire on a quiet street in Charleston, the kind of inconvenience most would grumble about, patch and forget. But for Althea, a woman whose life had been built on discipline, courage, and quiet resilience forged from years of service in places where survival itself was a battle. The tire was not just rubber meeting pavement. It was the first thread tugged loose in a web of arrogance, abuse, and silence that had been woven tightly around her community for years. What began as a personal mystery unfolded into something much larger than Althea herself. The tire led to a grainy video officer, Chad Renner, laughing as he drove his blade into her car's sidewall at 2 a.m. It led to neighbors whispering about stops that felt less like law enforcement and more like harassment, to buried complaints, and families too tired or too afraid to keep pressing for answers. Althea, who had once walked through villages where every step could trigger an explosion, now walked her own neighborhood with the same deliberate calm, piecing together the truth. Each detail, each testimony, each quiet voice she encouraged to rise became part of a case that couldn't be ignored. Her path wasn't fueled by rage. It wasn't about revenge. Althea Monroe's strength came from her refusal to be shaken or silenced. She did not storm into offices or shout over microphones. She documented, she listened, she moved with the same precision that had once earned her the call sign Shadow 3 in the Special Forces. Her fight wasn't just for herself. It became a stand for every neighbor who had been humiliated, dismissed, or told their pain was too small to matter. When the evidence was undeniable, Althea didn't ask for applause. She didn't ask for vengeance. She asked for accountability. And when she stood at the council chamber podium, the weight of the community at her back, her words carried more force than any outburst ever could. Peace without accountability isn't peace at all. It's permission. Her perseverance cracked open a system that had long thrived in shadows. Renner resigned under pressure. The city authorized an independent investigation into years of misconduct, and the people of Charleston, once resigned to quiet resentment, began to find their voices again. Althea didn't become the face of a movement by choice, but her calm defiance showed others that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the steady, unshaken voice that changes everything. The lesson from Althea's story isn't just about exposing one corrupt officer. It's about what each of us can do when faced with quiet wrongs, the ones the world expects us to endure in silence. It's about remembering that courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes courage is the choice to gather the facts, to stand steadily in the truth, and to refuse to be erased. It's about understanding that change rarely starts with those in power. It begins with ordinary people willing to take one step, then another, even when no one is clapping. In your own life, the battle might not be with a badge or a council, but the principle is the same when someone tries to make you small. When injustice hides in plain sight, you have a choice. Speak, document. Act not out of anger, but out of a commitment to the truth. One steady voice can give others permission to stand, and a chorus of those voices can change entire systems. If Althea Monroe's story moved you, if it reminded you of the power a single determined person can hold, don't let it stop here. Share this story, talk about it with the people around you, and take its lesson into your own challenges. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, justice, and the people who refuse to be silenced, subscribe to this channel. Your support fuels us to keep telling the stories that matter and to keep shining light where others would prefer shadows.